Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support this channel, its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. This video is part of a series entitled Questionable Witnesses, An Atheist Teaches Life of Christ. Today we'll be looking at Matthew 2:19 through 23 and Luke 2:39 through 40 and asking the question, was Jesus really a Nazarene? I am teaching the Gospels much the way I did many times in my churches as a pastor over the years, but now I'm teaching it as an atheist. The whole issue of this series has been to get to how many witnesses do the Gospel accounts actually have, and are they credible? The Bible's low bar criteria of 2 or 3 witnesses is our first test, and the next test is modern scholarship, which is a little more rigorous as to providing the truth or falsehood of claims with other criteria. Plus, I want to make any remarks about the story that I think that are pertinent. I also want to make some deconversion notes at the end. The two stories of Jesus settling in Nazareth are very different, so let's read them. Starting with Matthew 2:19 through 23, it says, "After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, and said, 'Get up and take the child and his mother to go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead.' So he got up and took the child with his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in the town called Nazareth. So it was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene." Luke reads very differently. Luke 2:39 through 40 says, "When Joseph and Mary had done everything required of the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong and was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him." It has taken us a long time to have 2 of the Gospels agree on anything and to fulfill the low bar 2 or 3 witness criteria of the Bible. One and only one thing is actually referenced in both of the Gospel accounts at this point, that Jesus and his family eventually settled in Nazareth. It has taken us this long to even have this, but it's the only thing we get agreement on these 2 passages because the rest is very, very different. But even this doesn't help us, once again, as the whole idea of how these witnesses are anonymous, the gospel writers being unknown, and the fact that they don't give us information as to where they got the stories in the first place is also unknown. If we were to put this into court, we would say, "Your Honor, we have 2 anonymous testimonies, both without corroboration, to stand as evidence that Jesus lived in Nazareth." The judge notes the 2 stories also differ greatly as well when he reads them. Sorry, evidence dismissed as hearsay. But it isn't just our modern world who would do this. The biblical system would also dismiss them because they don't agree. Even the Sanhedrin in Matthew 26:60 through 61, in Matthew's own gospel, in finding 2 false witnesses about Jesus, the testimony had to at least agree. It couldn't be different for the biblical criteria to work. Otherwise, the witnesses don't count. So the only one thing that they could possibly get that would stand is Jesus and his family settled in Nazareth. And this is still shaky because of the anonymous sources we are getting it from. But turning to modern scholarship, it gets worse. Really, there is nothing here to say, and that's the problem. There's no outside source to say that Jesus went to Egypt or settled in Nazareth, no census, no notation, nothing. A historian might note that if Jesus existed, this indicates a common belief among Christians that he lived in Nazareth as a boy, but you couldn't prove it by any other means. Mark also does mention that Jesus is in Nazareth, but all this indicates is that possibly the oral traditions all had one commonality, but they also seem to vary differently, and this is a good example of both Matthew and Luke recording different oral traditions that are very, very different from each other and tell a very, very different story. With modern scholarship, there really isn't any help to verify any of this part of the story. But there are other issues. Number one, the accounts differ greatly. Matthew is high political drama. It's a family on the run from a King Herod until Herod dies, and then they return to Bethlehem only to find Archelaus ruling, so they keep going until they get to the town of Nazareth. There's an idea in Matthew that the family already lived in Bethlehem and they had a house. There's no reference to them being in Nazareth ahead of time. And so the way Matthew tells the story, they were already residents of Bethlehem, and then they had to be moved into Egypt, and when they got back to Bethlehem, they realized they couldn't stay there because Archelaus was hostile to them. So they moved and withdrew to Galilee and settled in the town of Nazareth because it was nondescript. It's a very dramatic story. This is very much contrasted to Luke's account, which is far more mundane. The whole story in Luke basically is they went to be taxed. And while there, Mary had to give birth to her baby, so he was born in Bethlehem and fulfilled the messianic narrative even there. They get a visit from some shepherds who say they got visited by some angels. They take the opportunity to have Jesus circumcised and dedicated in the temple, and then they go back to Nazareth and settle down. There is no flight into Egypt in Luke, and that is significant in the differences. Now, you can connect the two stories by saying that Jesus' family stayed in Bethlehem after the census until the Magi incident, and then they had to leave. But that is conjecture and speculation, and it's not in the text itself. And when they come back, they see that Bethlehem is done with Archelaus, so they decide to head back to Nazareth, their hometown. What we see here is Matthew once again taking a dig at Herod's family again as somebody trying to prove Jesus is the Messiah over Herod. Luke doesn't seem to have such an agenda, so he simply moves the family back to Nazareth where they came from in the first place. The second problem with this passage is Matthew is using what prophets exactly, or what prophecy, when he says this, so was fulfilled what was said to the prophets that he would be called a Nazarene. Which prophets? And it's plural, in the sense that there's multiple prophets that supposedly attest to this. None of them are biblical prophets or any other prophets whose writings are preserved. There has been some attempt to connect this to the laws of the Nazarite vow in Numbers 6, 1 through 21. But being a Nazarite by vow and being a citizen of the town of Nazareth are two very different things. So what is Matthew doing at this point? Is he making up prophets in order to fit his narrative? Is he referencing something that they knew back then? We have to shrug our shoulders. If you need any further evidence that Matthew is stretching things a bit to fit his narrative and to post hoc rationalize a whole bunch of prophecies, including prophecies of who we don't know their names or know what they said, I don't know what else I can give to you. The fact is, Matthew could be straight up making up a bunch of prophets that said this. Hey, a whole bunch of prophets said that Jesus was going to live in Nazareth. Well, who? What? Where are their writings? Where do they say this? It's not the Bible, that's for sure. So, referencing an extra biblical source that would be considered prophetic by the Jews at the time, well, that's very interesting and kind of a nasty knock to the closing of the canon. Well, at this point, I just have to kind of point out once again that we're kind of left holding an empty sack. We get a little bit of a note here in Luke 2:40 about Jesus' childhood, that he grew up strong in wisdom. He just basically grew up to be a smart kid. But we don't have any real details about his life either at this point. Was he a boy in Nazareth? Yeah, I guess it's possible. There certainly seems to be a commonality among Christians that Jesus did grow up in Nazareth, but that's all we really have. Mark also does mention that Jesus was from Nazareth, but that's a pretty mundane thing. Basically, you could kind of say that there's a lot of witnesses, even though they're anonymous, that say that Jesus grew up in Nazareth, but that's all you can really say. Anything else is conjecture and speculation beyond that point about what his life was like, who he was around. We only have one testimony from one witness again that Jesus had a good childhood. We don't even have that. It's interesting that a lot of the pseudo-gospels and the gospels that weren't canonized seem to deal with Jesus' childhood. I think there was a lot of natural curiosity, so people made up a lot of stories about it. But it's in this context that these two stories are also made up. From a deconversion standpoint, this always was problematic for me when I was studying the Gospels. First of all, Matthew referencing prophets who aren't biblical. Okay, are we saying that these other prophets who aren't biblical are also spiritually guided by God? I suppose it's possible. But then again, you're engaged in a bunch of speculation. And why doesn't Matthew, who gives actual verse references for most of his prophecies, here he doesn't do that. it's almost like he's playing on the ignorance of his people and propagandizing again. Archelaus, of course, did exist, but he rebelled against Rome, and that's why the Rome eventually sent a governor to govern Judea. He was defeated because, like most people, he was stupid to take on the Roman army. It's not until much later that the Roman army seems to become more vulnerable. Here we have, once again, simply referencing Archelaus doesn't prove the story is true. There are plenty of historical fan fiction stuff that references real historical characters, but the events that they shroud everything else in are also all complete myth and fiction. So that doesn't help the case for anything, other than to say that the writer of Matthew knew that Archelaus had been governor of Judea after his father Herod. But that's a well-known thing and not really proof of anything. So what do we have left when you're deconverting at this point with this passage? You might have the idea that maybe the Gospels or the oral tradition, more likely, that they're copying, kind of preserve the idea that Jesus was born in Nazareth, and this is one point of agreement. But you have to do a lot of conjecture and speculation to knit these two stories together. You can do it, but you're relying on a lot of conjecture and hope that you're right. It's not a done deal or a given thing that these are true. And so you're kind of left with all this more questions than answers. The stories being very different also tell you that, from a deconversion point of view, that Matthew and Luke had very different agendas. Luke seems to be just writing down the oral tradition narrative that he wants to write down to drive his story about Jesus. But Matthew definitely has a political axe to grind with the Herod family, so he uses his story to kind of further, put that axe grinding into a higher mode, and really throw some shade on the entire Herod family at this point. It's not enough to criticize the person who's being said to be messianically fulfilling the prophecies. He also has to take a dig at his family as well, and the whole adding of nameless multiple prophets that say that Jesus was supposed to settle in Nazareth really does take the cake for me. The fact that he didn't reference a biblical prophet, that's really interesting from a Christian point of view. And why doesn't he reference somebody that's biblical at that point? Well, because it doesn't exist. So much for God's complete Word of God, or one that's inerrant, because we definitely have an error here. Which prophet? Who? And it's multiple prophets, so it's not like, you could just produce one. There's at least two. And so, I don't know, you start to begin, if you haven't learned what I'm trying to do here with these biblical studies, is demystify the Bible. That the Bible is a human book. It's not a divine book. And any person who says it's a divine book is making a statement of faith and not one of evidence. Because the evidence seems to indicate that God can't get his crap together when he inspires his writers. He inspires one writer to basically write this high drama and political stuff that he needs. And then he has another writer inspired to write a very mundane story about how the family goes to Bethlehem, does the census. The only exciting thing happening is, angels appearing to shepherds who suddenly show up in town and say that they had angels appear to them. Whether or not that is true, we only have the shepherd's word to take for it, even if this story isn't complete legend or mythological development. The point of the matter is the getting rid of the this is the inspired word of God, getting rid of all that notion in your head is very much evident in this story. These stories are so different, and they don't knit together well without conjecture and speculation. So I'm hoping that I'm getting across to you how human the Bible is, that it isn't a work of God. It's a work of men who had an agenda, and they began to put out what they want to be there. Whether Jesus was a boy in Nazareth, I suppose this is one of the things that we can probably allow, because it seems that it was a common trait in Christianity to say so. But that's just their say-so. It's not proof that he actually lived in Nazareth. That could also be part of oral tradition narrative that just everybody adopted as the story spread and got created. So that's kind of my thoughts about this passage. And so if you have any other additions that you think should be added, any more comments or the like, put it in the comments section. I'm always interested to hear your comments on this particular topic. But I would have to conclude that maybe Jesus lived in Nazareth based on the accounts that we have. But we're taking a whole bunch of anonymous accounts into account that only really indicate that, well, Jesus might have existed and he might have lived in a town kind of Nazareth. We don't really have any proof of that. So that's it for me today. So comment away. If you want to support this channel's mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, my PayPal link is in the description. There's also super chat, super thanks. Those are always welcome. Liking and sharing the video gets it more notice, so I get more views and the ad revenue comes in. So those are all wonderful things. But the best thing you can do is become a member of the channel. The monthly support every month really allows me to focus on making videos like this where I'm being more informative and less with the drama so that I get the views and clicks. So for you members, this is kind of your video, the videos that you like and enjoy, and you support them. And that's much more beneficial to me than anything else you can do. So I appreciate all my members. Thank you to all of them. To all my citizens, Rabyd citizens, and tribunes of the Rabyd Nation, thank you very, very much. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around, and then it's over. So you want to take all your time, money, and opportunities and spend them on yourself, the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.